Good morning and welcome to Peace Out, where we are all learning together to peace out. Well, we're learning it and we're together, so we're learning it together, right? Hope you had a great morning. You had a good morning yesterday, a Monday morning, and now it's Tuesday. We can put Monday behind us and press into the rest of the week, right? So we're going to talk about somebody different today. Yesterday we talked about David. We talked about how he was the youngest. We talked about how his brothers tried to keep him in his place and keep him down and under and kind of oppress him a little bit and kind of made fun of him and kind of, just kind of, they didn't really respect him, even though they saw the prophet anoint him as king. Maybe they didn't understand the significance. Maybe they did, right? But he still, through the years, God promoted him and promoted him. That doesn't mean it wasn't rocky in between when he got the promise and the fulfillment of the promise. And we're going to talk about somebody else like that today. We'll talk about Joseph again today. And I don't know. I was just thinking about these two over the weekend because I was thinking about how it was their brothers that put them down. It was their brothers that tried to keep them, with David, he was like, why aren't you taking care of those sheep? He was trying to make him look smaller or lesser in the eyes of the others. It didn't deter David for even a second. He just said, let's go take out this giant. Why are you just standing here, right? And so he headed on out and took care of Goliath, right? It didn't deter him at all. He didn't buy into it. He just went, what did I do? And he just went back into what he needed to get done. Well, I was also thinking about Joseph, and it was his brothers that did the same thing to him. They were jealous of his dreams. Now, maybe Joseph wasn't perfect. David wasn't perfect either. We know that, right? But Joseph maybe he should have just kept the dreams to himself, right? And maybe he caused the jealousy. I don't know. You can't really cause it. You can't make somebody be jealous. That's their choice, right? But he could have just quietly told his dad, "Hey, Dad, guess what?" and just let it be between him. And maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was just fascinated. I have a lot of dreams, and usually I write them down. And sometimes they're significant, and sometimes they're just not, right? But sometimes they are. But I learned early on when I started having dreams as a very young person, to just keep it to yourself, and that saves yourself a lot of conflict. Then if God tells you to share it or something happens, you go, "Oh, there was that dream. Wow, that's just crazy that God moves that way," right? But I learned early, you just keep some things to yourself. Everything ain't supposed to be told. Joseph didn't know that. Joseph was just like, I had this dream. And he wasn't even saying, you are all going to bow down to me. He was like, there was the sun and the moon and 11 stars. And they're like, are we all going to? They all interpreted the dream for him. And he still didn't quite get it. And then he went through this brutal betrayal. And he went through horrible slavery he lived in. And he suffered. And we know that because in Genesis 41:52, he named his second son Ephraim, which means fruitful. And it says he named him Ephraim because it says, God has made me fruitful in this land of my suffering. He suffered all those years. And sometimes we don't always get that whole story, right? Sometimes we just read, oh, they threw him into the thing and God made it perfect. In the end, it was great. But we forget all those years in between, right? And Joseph didn't have the story of Joseph to read to encourage himself like we do. We can look at the whole story we can read the whole story in maybe 10, 15 minutes, right? Just a few chapters there in Genesis. But he lived a lifetime in those stories, a lifetime of suffering. And just about the time he thought it was going to be better, he gets promoted and promoted and promoted, and then he goes to jail for something he didn't even do. It had to be heart-wrenching. His journey is heart-wrenching, the whole journey. And he couldn't look back and read his own story to see that in the end, God was going to bring it about. But he did say this in the end in chapter 45, little numbers. In verse 5 of chapter 45, he says, but you don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me. He totally forgave his brothers. He could have resented them. He could have had them killed just for coming to Egypt. He was top dog, man. He could have done anything. He could have got them back, but he did not because he kept his heart pure towards God throughout the years of his suffering. He said, you did this to me. He said, don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me, for God did it. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. And so he said, he made me a father to Pharaoh. And so he saw God woven through the pages of his story. even though there was suffering and there was triumph and there was demotion and promotion and good things and bad things, God was still woven all into his story. And he could go back to Adam and Eve. He had that. He had Abraham. He had Noah, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, and then his dad Isaac, right? And then Jacob, or his grandfather Isaac, and then Jacob, and then Joseph. And he had a few things to go back and draw. But what did he learn from his forefathers? Just to trust God for the journey. Just keep trusting him for the journey. God's in the story even when it goes bad. God's in the story even when it's difficult. God's in the story even when he ended up in jail. He was betrayed by his brothers. God was still in the story. God didn't go, oh, I don't do betrayals. As a matter of fact, Jesus is going to choose the person who's going to betray him. 2,000 years later, we see that in the New Testament. God still loves the betrayer, and he still loves those who are betrayed. He still loves everyone. He's still in the story. And then he's a slave, and we don't have a lot about that story. He was a young man. We don't have the little pieces of that story, but we know he was a slave, and we know that it wasn't good, right? It wasn't pleasant. He suffered. Besides the separation from his family, now he's forced to work for somebody who we don't know. They didn't value their slaves back then. You don't know. We don't know, right? And then he goes, but God was still in that. He says, you know what? It's okay. I'm going to take care of you, even in slavery, whether you're bound or free. Paul says in the New Testament, he says, you're still Christ's. You're still God's. He didn't say, oh, I don't do slavery. No, I don't do bondage. Nope. As a matter of fact, we know Joseph prophesied that God was going to come get all of his brothers come up to Egypt. And Joseph said, when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you. When God comes to get you, to take you home, take you to the promised land, take my bones with you. Because he knew he was going to die, but he prophesied what God was going to do, and that God was still woven in the story, right? And so then whether he was in prison, God doesn't go, I don't do prisons. Matter of fact, he got Paul and Silas out of prison, right? He walked right in. The angel walked right in and said, come on, boys. But God doesn't say, I don't do prisons. He doesn't say, I don't do your suffering. I just can't watch that. I'm just going to stand over here and see how it turns out. No, God's woven in our stories, no matter how bad they feel or how good they feel, whether we're up, whether we're down, whether we're in prison, out of prison, whether we even did something to get us in prison or did something to get us out of prison or kept ourselves out of it. It doesn't matter. Excuse me. God is woven in our stories. He's all through Joseph's story. And Joseph made a decision to follow God, to pursue God, even in the hard times of his life. Because we see in the end here, he's saying, you know what? God brought me here. God's been with me. He didn't abandon me. You guys abandoned me. You threw me away. You didn't give me the time of day. You gave me in, you sold your own brother into slavery. But God has brought me here to save you. What a cool turn of events. God is in our story, and we can trust that in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the peaceful times, in the middle of the not so messy times, God's still woven in the story. It's up to us, like Joseph, to keep him in the forefront of our mind. Because even when Joseph was in jail, he was like, God gave me a gift of interpreting dreams. He was even forgotten there because the guy got out and got so excited that he got out. He forgot to tell him about Joseph until 2 or 3 years later, right? And so, but God was woven in his story. The suffering, the pain, the good times. Then he's blessed, and he ends up being like second, right under the king, right? God was in that too. He's in the good stuff and the bad stuff. Nothing is off limits to God. He says, I'm in your story. I'm walking through time with you. That's his whole desire, is to walk through whatever we're facing in time with us. We just got to focus on him instead of everything else that's going on around. As we deal with our day-to-days, just know that God is woven in your story. As a matter of fact, if you look around today, you might just find some places that he's been woven into your story. You might even be able to see them and go, oh, I know God was right there. I know God had me here. I know he brought me through this. He brought me through that. He can bring me through whatever is on my plate today, because he's woven into the ups and downs, the ins and outs of our day-to-day lives. We just have to acknowledge that he's there and enjoy the fact or the truth. Facts change, truth doesn't. Enjoy the truth that God wants to experience time with us. He's not just watching from heaven. He's walking through time with us. That's why we can peace out. Peace out. Have a great day. Hope I said something that made sense. I'll see you again tomorrow.